Steve Harvey freezes when woman reveals who paid her rent for 10 years there was a time when neighbors looked out for each other without being asked. When people did good things not for credit or attention, but simply because it was the right thing to do. That kind of selfless love is rare these days, and most people have stopped believing it even exists. But what happened on Family Feud in April 2024 would prove every one of those doubters wrong. When a 58-year-old woman from Chicago told Steve Harvey who had been secretly paying her rent for an entire decade, Steve Harvey did not laugh. He did not crack a joke. He did not move. He stood completely frozen in the middle of that stage, staring at her because what she revealed was so powerful, so unexpected, and so deeply human that the man who always had something to say could not find a single word. The audience sat in total shock. And by the time the truth was fully out, there was not a dry eye in the entire building. Before we dive into this incredible story, take a second and hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. You are going to want to be here for every moment of what is about to unfold. The Mitchell family from Chicago, Illinois walked onto the Family Feud stage with matching forest green shirts and the kind of energy that told you they had been looking forward to this day for a long time. There were 5 of them, and from the moment they took their places behind the podium, you could tell this was a family that had been through something together. They were not just close. They were bonded in the way that only hardship can bond people, where every smile carries the weight of a struggle that made it possible. Standing at the front of the line was Diane Mitchell. She was 58 years old, a retired school bus driver who had spent 26 years waking up before dawn to drive children safely to school and back home again in the neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side. Diane was the kind of woman that every community has but never fully appreciates until she is gone. She knew every child's name on her bus. She kept granola bars in the glove compartment for the kids who got on in the morning looking hungry. She waited an extra minute at the stop on Cottage Grove Avenue every winter because she knew the little boy in apartment 412 had to walk his younger sister down 3 flights of stairs and across a parking lot before they could reach the bus. And those extra 60 seconds meant the difference between them making it or being left behind in the cold. Next to Diane was her son, Kevin, who was 36 years old. Kevin worked as a firefighter for the Chicago Fire Department and had been on the job for 12 years. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the calm, steady presence of a man whose job required him to walk into burning buildings. Kevin was the one who had organized the Family Feud application. He had done it quietly without telling his mother, because Kevin did everything quietly. That was his way. He showed love through action, not words, and he had learned that from the person who mattered most in his life, though the audience did not know that yet. The third member of the team was Diane's daughter, Angela, who was 33 and worked as an office manager at a dental practice on the North Side. Angela was the talker of the family. She was quick with a joke, fast with a comeback, and had the kind of infectious laugh that made everyone around her smile whether they wanted to or not. Angela had her mother's warmth and her father's sharp wit, and she was the one who kept the family group chat alive with memes and messages and daily check-ins that made sure nobody ever felt alone. The fourth member was Diane's nephew, Terrell, who was 29 and worked at a warehouse distribution center on the West Side. Terrell had grown up rough. His own mother, Diane's younger sister, had struggled with addiction for most of his childhood, and Diane had taken him in when he was 11 years old without a moment of hesitation. She raised him alongside Kevin and Angela, never once making him feel like he was anything other than her own son. Terrell called Diane Mama D, and when he talked about her, his voice carried a reverence that you could not fake. The fifth member of the team was the one who would turn this episode into something nobody would ever forget. Her name was Ruth Ann Watkins. She was 81 years old. She was not a blood relative of the Mitchell family. She was Diane's neighbor. She had lived in the apartment directly below Diane in the same building on South Drexel Boulevard for over 30 years. Ruth Ann was small and moved slowly, leaning on a wooden cane that her late husband, Chester, had carved for her from a piece of oak before he passed away in 2009. She wore a pale blue dress with a pearl brooch pinned near her collar, and her silver hair was pressed into neat waves that framed a face full of laugh lines and quiet dignity. When the producers had asked the Mitchell family who their 5th team member would be, Diane had not hesitated for a single second. "Miss Ruth Ann," she said. "She is family. She has been family for longer than some of my actual family." Ruth Ann had resisted at first. She told Diane she was too old for television, that she would slow them down, that they should pick someone younger and faster. But Diane insisted, and when Diane Mitchell insisted on something, that was the end of the discussion. What nobody in the audience knew, what the producers did not know, what even Steve Harvey had no idea about, was the secret that connected these two women. A secret that had been kept for 10 years. A secret that was about to come out on national television in the most unexpected way imaginable. The Mitchell family was facing off against the Kowalski family from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The Kowalskis were a fun, boisterous Polish-American family who had clearly come to have a good time. Both families greeted each other warmly before the game started. Steve Harvey came out and worked the crowd, cracking jokes and getting everyone loose. When he reached the Mitchell family, he stopped at Ruth Ann and looked at her with the gentle respect he always showed to the older contestants. "And who is this beautiful lady?" he asked. Ruth Ann looked up at Steve and said in a voice that was soft but carried across the studio, "My name is Ruth Ann Watkins. I am 81 years old, and I am here because this woman," she pointed at Diane with her cane, "is the best person I have ever known in my entire life." The audience gave a warm round of applause. Steve smiled and nodded. Diane put her arm around Ruth Ann and squeezed her gently. It was a sweet moment, the kind that happened on Family Feud all the time. But this one was different. This one was the beginning of something that would shake that studio to its core. The game started well for the Mitchell family. Kevin gave a strong #1 answer in the first round that set the tone. Angela got the audience laughing with a clever response that made Steve shake his head and say, "Now see, that is exactly right and exactly wrong at the same time." Terrell held his own in the second round, giving 2 solid answers that kept the family in the lead. Even Ruth Ann contributed, answering a question about things you find in a kitchen with a prayer, which was not on the board but made Steve laugh so hard he had to lean on the podium to steady himself. By the 4th round, the Mitchell family had a comfortable lead over the Kowalskis. The mood was light and fun. The families were joking with each other across the stage. The audience was having a great time. Everything was going exactly the way a normal Family Feud episode was supposed to go. And then Steve read the next question. "We surveyed 100 people. Name someone who helped you when you needed it most." It was a broad question, the kind that could go in 100 different directions. Most people would say a parent, a spouse, a friend, a teacher. It was Diane's turn to answer. She stepped up to the podium with her usual calm confidence. Steve repeated the question, and Diane, without missing a beat, turned her head and looked directly at Ruth Ann. "My neighbor, Miss Ruth Ann," Diane said. Her voice was steady, but there was an emotion underneath it that anyone paying close attention could hear. The board lit up. Neighbor was on the board, the audience clapped, but Diane was not celebrating. She was still looking at Ruth Ann with an expression that said this was about something much deeper than a game show answer. Steve noticed immediately. He had spent over a decade reading people on that stage, and he could tell when an answer carried real weight behind it. He looked at Diane, then at Ruth Ann, and instead of moving on to the next question, he did what Steve Harvey always did when he sensed there was a story worth telling. He asked, "Diane, tell me about that. How did Miss Ruth Ann help you when you needed it most?" Diane took a breath. She glanced at her children. Kevin gave her a small nod. Angela reached out and touched her mother's arm. Terrell was watching with his jaw set tight, the way he always looked when emotions were building up inside him and he was trying to hold them in. "Mr. Harvey," Diane began, "23 years ago, my husband, Ronald, passed away. He was a sanitation worker for the city of Chicago. He got up every morning at 4:30, rain or shine, snow or heat, and he did his job without complaint for 19 years. He was the hardest working man I ever knew." Diane paused. The studio was getting quieter. "When Ronald died, I was 35 years old with 2 kids. Kevin was 13 and Angela was 10, and I had just taken in my nephew Terrell, who was 6. I had my bus driving job, but Ronald's income was what kept us above water. Without it, I could not make rent. I could not feed 3 kids and pay the electric bill and keep the heat on in a Chicago winter. I was drowning." Steve was listening with his full attention, the game completely forgotten. The audience was locked in. Ruth Ann was sitting in her spot at the end of the podium, looking down at her hands, her fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of her cane. Diane continued, "I was 3 months behind on rent. The landlord had given me a final notice. I was sitting at my kitchen table at midnight, looking at the numbers, and I could not make them work no matter how many times I added them up. I had already decided that I was going to have to move the kids out of the city, maybe down to my cousin's place in Mississippi, because I could not afford to live in Chicago anymore. I was going to lose our home." She stopped for a moment and pressed her hand against her chest, steadying herself. "The next morning I went to pay what I could to the landlord, and he looked at me confused and said, 'Diane, your rent is paid. Somebody came in yesterday and paid your rent for the next 3 months.' I did not understand. I asked him who. He said the person asked to remain anonymous." The audience murmured. Steve's eyebrows lifted slightly. He was leaning in now, sensing that this was going somewhere he had not expected. I thought it was a one-time thing, Diane said. Maybe someone from the church, maybe one of Ronald's old coworkers. I was grateful and I moved on. But then the next quarter came and my rent was paid again. Anonymous, and the quarter after that, and the quarter after that. Mr. Harvey, someone paid my rent anonymously for 10 years. 10 years, from the time Ronald died until my kids were grown and I was stable enough to handle it on my own. Steve's mouth opened slightly. The audience gasped. 10 years of anonymous rent payments was not a small act of charity. That was a commitment. That was a sacrifice that required real money, real discipline, and real love sustained over a decade. Someone had been quietly keeping this family afloat for 10 years without ever asking for credit or recognition. Diane, Steve said carefully, his voice low and serious. Do you know who it was? Diane nodded. She was crying now, but she was smiling through the tears. I found out 5 years ago. I came home early from work one day because my bus had a mechanical problem. I saw someone coming out of the landlord's office on the first floor. She did not see me, but I saw her. Diane turned and looked at Ruth Ann. It was Miss Ruth Ann. It was her the entire time. The studio went silent. Then the gasps came, one after another, rolling through the audience like a wave. Steve Harvey did not move. He did not speak. He stood completely still, frozen in place, staring at Diane and then slowly turning to look at Ruth Ann. His mouth was open. His eyes were wide. The man who had built his entire career on quick wit and fast reactions was standing in the middle of the Family Feud stage with absolutely nothing to say. Ruth Ann had not looked up. She was still staring at her hands, gripping her cane and shaking her head slowly back and forth. Diane, you were not supposed to tell that, she said quietly, but the microphone picked up every word. That was between me and the Lord. Kevin stepped forward. His voice was thick and strained, the voice of a firefighter who ran into burning buildings without flinching but could not hold it together when it came to this. Miss Ruth Ann was living on Social Security and Chester's pension. That is it. That is all she had. And she gave a piece of it every single month to make sure we kept our home. For 10 years, she ate less so we could eat. She went without so we would not have to, and she never said a word. Angela was openly sobbing. Terrell had turned away from the camera, his shoulders shaking. The audience was a mess. People were crying, holding each other, some standing up with their hands over their mouths. Steve Harvey still had not moved. For what felt like an eternity but was probably about 15 seconds, Steve Harvey stood frozen on that stage. The cameras were locked on him, capturing a moment of genuine, unscripted human shock that would be replayed millions of times. Then Steve did something that surprised everyone. He walked away from the podium, turned his back to the audience, and put both hands on top of his head. His shoulders rose and fell as he took several deep breaths. When he turned back around, tears were streaming down his face. He walked slowly toward Ruth Ann. The audience was so quiet that you could hear his shoes on the stage. Stopped in front of her, and then Steve Harvey, the man who stood 6'2" and had commanded stages and arenas for 30 years, got down on one knee so he could look this 81-year-old woman in the eye. Miss Ruth Ann, Steve said, his voice barely holding together, I need to understand something. You lived on a fixed income, Social Security, and a pension. And you took your own money you needed to live on, and you paid this woman's rent for 10 years. You never told her. You never told anyone. Why? Ruth Ann finally looked up. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady in the way that only someone who has lived 81 years and made peace with every decision they have ever made can be steady. Because Chester and I never had children, she said. The Lord did not bless us that way, but he put Diane and those babies right above my ceiling. I could hear them up there every day. I heard Kevin practicing his homework out loud. I heard Angela singing in the bathtub. I heard little Terrell crying at night when he first came to live there because he missed his mama. And I heard Diane walking the floors at 2 in the morning, back and forth, trying to figure out how she was going to keep it all together. Ruth Ann paused and tightened her grip on her cane. When Ronald died, I watched that woman carry the weight of the world on her shoulders without complaining one time. Not once. She got up every morning and she drove those children to school on her bus, and she came home, and she cooked dinner, and she helped with homework, and she tucked those babies in, and then she sat at that kitchen table, and she cried where they could not see her. I know because my kitchen was right below hers, and I could hear everything. The studio was completely, utterly silent. Steve had not moved from his knee. Tears were running into his mustache, and he did not care. Chester was still alive then, Ruth Ann continued. I told him what I wanted to do. He did not even think about it. He said, Ruthie, that is what neighbors are for. So we went to the landlord and we set it up. We paid a little each month from our savings, and then after Chester passed, I kept going because I had promised him I would. And I promised the Lord I would. And where I come from, you do not break a promise to your husband or your God. Steve closed his eyes and lowered his head. When he opened them again, he looked at Ruth Ann with an expression that anyone watching could only describe as awe. "Miss Ruth Ann, you could have used that money for yourself. You could have eaten better, lived more comfortably, taken care of your own needs. Why did you sacrifice for a family that was not even yours?" Ruth Ann looked at Steve as if the answer was the most obvious thing in the world. "Baby, that family is mine. They have been mine since the day they moved in above me. Blood does not make family. Love does. Chester knew that. The Lord knows that. And now," she looked at the audience, "I suppose everybody knows that." The audience erupted. The sound that filled that studio was not just applause. It was 200 people releasing every emotion they had been holding in for the past 10 minutes. People were standing, crying, shouting, and clapping all at the same time. The Kowalski family, the opposing team, had abandoned any pretense of competition and were standing on their side of the stage in tears. Maria Kowalski, their family captain, had her hand pressed over her heart and was shaking her head in disbelief. Steve stood up from his knee and faced the cameras. His voice was raw, stripped of all performance, all showmanship, all of the polished delivery that had made him famous. "I want everybody watching this to hear me right now. This woman right here, Miss Ruth Ann Watkins, 81 years old, living on Social Security and a pension, gave up a piece of every check she received for 10 years to keep a family she was not related to in their home. She never asked for thank you. She never asked to be repaid. She never told a soul. She did it because she believed that is what you do when someone near you is struggling. You help, period." Steve paused, wiped his face with both hands, and continued. "I have met presidents. I have met billionaires. I have met people the world calls great. But I am telling you right now, standing on this stage, the greatest person I have ever met in my life is Miss Ruth Ann Watkins from South Drexel Boulevard in Chicago, Illinois. And I am not ashamed to say that she just taught me something about love that I did not know." Then Steve did something that the producers later said they had never seen in the history of the show. He walked over to the production area, spoke to the executive producer for about 30 seconds, and walked back to center stage. "The Mitchell family won this game, and they are going to play fast money for the $20,000. But I want to announce right now that regardless of the outcome, my personal foundation is donating $50,000 to Miss Ruth Ann Watkins. That money is hers. And if she decides to give every penny of it away to somebody else, that is her business because that is the kind of woman she is." Ruth Ann shook her head and waved her cane. "Steve Harvey, I do not need $50,000. Give it to somebody who needs it." Steve laughed through his tears. "See, you see what I mean? Even right now, she is trying to give it away. Miss Ruth Ann, you are taking that money, and that is final." The audience roared with laughter and applause, and for the first time all day, the heaviness in the studio lifted into something warm and bright and full of hope. The Mitchell family played fast money and won. Diane and Kevin combined for 204 points, taking home the $20,000 prize. When the final number was revealed, Diane walked straight past Steve, straight past the cameras, and went directly to Ruth Ann. She kneeled down in front of the older woman, took both of her hands, and said, "You saved us, Miss Ruth Ann. You saved my family, and I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know how much that means." Ruth Ann cupped Diane's face in her hands the way a mother does and said, "Baby, you saved me right back. After Chester died, I had nobody. You and those kids gave me a reason to get up every morning. You think I was helping you, but you were keeping me alive." It was the kind of moment that no scriptwriter could invent, because real love does not follow a script. It just shows up, quiet and steady, and does what needs to be done. When the episode aired 5 weeks later, the response shattered every record Family Feud had ever set for a single clip. The moment Steve Harvey froze on stage was viewed over 75 million times across all platforms in the first week. It was covered by every major news network in the country and was picked up by international outlets in 22 countries. But the numbers barely scratched the surface of what this story meant to the people who heard it. Within 48 hours of the episode airing, a GoFundMe page that Angela had set up for Ruth Ann had raised over $600,000. Donations came from every corner of the country and from around the world. A retired teacher in London sent $500 with a note that said, "Mrs. Watkins reminds me that goodness does not need an audience." A family in Japan sent $1,000 with a message that was translated from Japanese and read simply, "For the woman who understood that walls between apartments do not have to be walls between hearts." A 12-year-old girl in Atlanta sent her entire birthday money, $42, with a handwritten note that said, "Dear Miss Ruth Ann, I want to be like you when I grow up." Ruth Ann was overwhelmed by the attention and initially uncomfortable with it. She told Diane repeatedly that she had not done what she did so people would notice. But Diane and the family helped her understand that her story was giving other people permission to be generous in their own lives, and that by letting people celebrate her, she was continuing to give. The ripple effects were extraordinary. Churches and community organizations across the country launched what became known as Ruth Ann Funds, small pools of money collected from congregation members and neighbors specifically designated to help families in the community who were one bad month away from losing their housing. Within 6 months, over 300 Ruth Ann Funds had been established in 41 states. The concept was simple, modeled on exactly what Ruth Ann had done. Neighbors helping neighbors quietly, consistently, without expectation of recognition. Steve Harvey featured the Mitchell family and Ruth Ann on his daytime talk show 8 weeks after the episode aired. Ruth Ann walked onto the set to a 3-minute standing ovation that she tried to wave off at least 4 times before finally accepting it with a shy, embarrassed smile. Steve sat down across from her and spoke to her with a tenderness that his regular viewers said they had never seen from him before. "Miss Ruth Ann, I have thought about you every single day since we met on that stage," Steve said. "I keep asking myself the same question. How did you do it for 10 years without telling anybody?" Ruth Ann looked at him calmly and said, "Steve, when Chester and I made the decision, we made it together and we made it before God. It was not a sacrifice to us. It was an honor. Diane was raising those children right. She was keeping that family together through the worst thing that can happen to a woman, losing her husband. The least we could do was make sure she did not lose her home too. If you saw someone drowning, would you wait for them to ask for help, or would you just reach out your hand?" Steve sat quietly for a moment, then said, "That might be the most important thing anyone has ever said on this show." The audience agreed, and the clip of Ruth Ann's response became one of the most shared moments in talk show history that year. Kevin, the firefighter, gave an interview to a Chicago newspaper a few months after the episode aired that revealed something the family had kept private. He said that when he was 14, about a year after his father died, he had overheard his mother on the phone with the landlord, confused about why her rent had been paid. He said he watched his mother hang up the phone and sit at the table, crying, not from sadness but from relief. He said that moment was the reason he became a firefighter. "I saw what it looked like when someone saved your life and you did not even know who they were. I wanted to be that person for other people. I wanted to run into the worst moments of someone's day and make it better. Miss Ruth Ann showed me what that looked like before I even understood what she was doing." 1 year after the episode, the Mitchell family threw a celebration for Ruth Ann's 82nd birthday at the community center on South Drexel Boulevard. Over 200 people attended, including neighbors, church members, friends, and dozens of strangers who had driven from across the state to meet the woman whose story had touched them. Steve Harvey sent a video message that was played on a projector screen. "Miss Ruth Ann," Steve said in the video, "you told me that blood does not make family and love does. I want you to know that because of you, I have looked at every person in my life differently. I have asked myself every day since I met you whether I am doing enough for the people around me, and the honest answer is usually no, but I am trying, and that is because of you." Ruth Ann stood up at the end of the party, steadied herself on her cane, and addressed the room. "I appreciate all of this more than I can say, but I need you all to know something. What I did for Diane was not special. It was normal. It is what we used to do. We used to look out for each other. We used to notice when our neighbor was hurting and we did something about it without being asked. Somewhere along the way, we stopped doing that. I'm just an old woman who kept doing what used to be ordinary. If my story means anything, I hope it means that ordinary goodness can come back. I hope it means that the next time you hear your neighbor crying through the wall, you do not turn up your television. You knock on their door." The room was silent for a long moment, and then the applause began, slow at first, and then building into something thunderous that shook the windows of that community center. Ruth Ann sat back down and reached for Diane's hand, and the two women held on to each other the way they had been holding on to each other for over 30 years, quietly, firmly, and without any intention of letting go. Diane retired from her bus driving job the following year. She moved to a slightly larger apartment in the same building, on the same floor as Ruth Ann, so she could check on her every day the way Ruth Ann had checked on her family for decades. Kevin was promoted to lieutenant in the fire department. Angela got married and named her first daughter Ruth, after the woman she said had kept a roof over her head when she was too young to even understand how close they had come to losing it. Terrell enrolled in night school to study social work. Inspired by the woman who had treated him like family from the very first day, he arrived scared and confused at the age of 6. And Marcus, the nephew who had grown up in that apartment because Diane had opened her door to him, he started volunteering with a housing assistance nonprofit on the South Side, helping other families stay in their homes the same way Ruth Ann had helped his. Steve Harvey continued to talk about Ruth Ann in interviews for years. He kept a photo of her in his office, right next to the photo of his own mother. When people asked him about the most memorable moment in his television career, he never hesitated. An 81-year-old woman from Chicago taught me that love is not a feeling. It is a decision you make every single month for 10 years, even when nobody is watching, even when it costs you something, even when the person you are helping has no idea it is you. That is the kind of love that holds the world together. And I did not fully understand it until Ruth Ann Watkins showed it to me on my own stage. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you are the first to hear stories like this. Drop a comment below and tell us what Ruth Ann's story means to you. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that there are still good people in this world doing good things for no reason other than love. We will see you in the next one.